Welcome to 10 Minute Record Reviews, episode 160. And this time I'm going to talk about Herbie Mann's 1971 album on Cotillion Records, Push Push. And this is the first Canadian pressing, and it's worth getting an early pressing for this fabulous die-cut cover, which of course has so much going for it. Where do we start? Well, first of all, we have Herbie's slightly oily, hairy, nude torso and shoulders. There's also, I guess, an alternative photo in the back, which was sad naked Herbie. This is more proud naked Herbie. This is the picture I think that you see when you look up "Hello Ladies" in the dictionary of 1970s phraseology. But it gets better because, of course, you have this die-cut gatefold, and then inside is this fabulous velour-treated photograph of two people humping. And that, to me, is, well, you're getting your money's worth. Let's just put it that way. This is largely soul jazz. At times it verges a bit into pop. Mann, of course, at this point had been a jazz artist for 20 years. He was always interested in crossovers. He had been in the 1950s and earlier in the 1960s. Other people who did that kind of stuff include Miles Davis and Donald Byrd. Of those three, only Miles really gets the respect he deserves. Mann was a real pioneer, and one of the best examples of this is actually the time in the early 1960s when bossa nova leaves its Brazilian birthplace and becomes basically a global phenomenon. Conventional wisdom has it that Charlie Byrd and Stan Getz brought bossa nova to the world with their album Jazz Samba. But Mann has just as strong a claim. He'd visited Brazil too, and he was working with Brazilian musicians as early as 1961. He's also arguably the person who was most responsible for making the flute a lead instrument in jazz and paving the way for people like Bobby Humphrey, Paul Horn, Hubert Laws, and other people in the late 1960s and early 70s. His willingness to cross genres meant that at the time when jazz was faltering in the early 1970s, he was encountering commercial success, and of course, he got slammed for that. But as time goes by and we can look back without taking sides, that particular era, I think you can say the guy was being rewarded for making good records. It's a kind of a jazz theocracy, jazz mullahs who want to banish the work of people like Donald Byrd and Herbie Mann from the 1970s into the realm of not jazz. I think we need to take that with a pinch of salt. Defining jazz down to something which at that stage really had a very, very small following doesn't elevate the genre. I think it just basically defines a clique. So Herbie Mann is, of course, a stage name. He was born Herbert J. Solomon in 1930 in Brooklyn. As a teenager, he learned to play a variety of woodwinds, and he cuts his teeth in the 1950s in a variety of bop combos. He's playing tenor sax, he's playing bass clarinet, and of course, he's playing flute. He was always interested in rhythm and in new musical ideas, and his crossover work starts early in the late 1950s when he gets the opportunity to go on one of these State Department goodwill tours, basically propaganda tours during the Cold War, which the American government was running to export American culture as an example to Europe and to Africa and to Asia and so on. And people that benefited from this included Herbie Mann, Dave Brubeck did a lot of this stuff, and so of course did Charlie Byrd and others. And a lot of cross-pollination happens. Yes, in theory, American culture is being exported. What happens is these American jazz artists bring a ton back with them. And what Mann does in Africa is really cotton on to Afro-Cuban music. And he comes back and he makes a superb album called Flautista, which is basically a distillation of what he heard in Africa. Same thing happens when he goes to Brazil in 1961. He ends up recording with some of the biggest names in bossa nova, with Jobim, with Joel Gilberto, with Baden Powell, and a whole bunch of other folks. And there are several records which he puts out in the early 1960s which are really worth going to dig up and find. And in my opinion, and I'm a big bossa nova fan, those include Brazil, bossa nova, and blues, Do the Bossa Nova, and the one he did with Joel Gilberto, where they sort of alternate lead on tracks, recorded in Rio. All the way through the 1960s on his records and his club dates, Mann would blend Latin sounds with more typical bop sounds. One of his good practices was to always surround himself with good musicians, and that includes giving a first break to a young Chick Corea who starts to play with Herbie in the mid-1960s. R.I.P. Chick, who sadly passed away yesterday, and you can hear him playing with Mann on two records, Latin Man and Monday Night at the Village Gate. Gradually, over the 1960s, Herbie's sound begins to incorporate more and more blues and soul elements, and that reaches its kind of early climax in his groundbreaking album from 1969, which was a big hit, Memphis Underground. And to give you a sense of the musical melting pot in that record, the players include Sonny Sherrick, who would go on to have a real boundary-pushing career as an avant-garde guitarist in the 1970s, and Roy Ayers, who of course would be a giant of jazz, funk, and eventually disco in the later part of the 1970s. This summer was made in the early summer of 1971. I guess it was hot because that's why Herbie's underdressed and a little sweaty. The producer is Arif Mardin, but the record really is all about the quality of the personnel, and I'll go through some of the session players, who's kind of amazing who Herbie assembles for this album. Cornell Dupree, this omnipresent studio guy who played in all kinds of soul and jazz dates in the 60s and 70s. He played with Miles, he played with Archie Shepp, Aretha Franklin, Joe Cocker. On bass, there are three different players, all of whom are legendary in their own way. First of all is Chuck Rainey. This is a guy who, along with Bernard Edwards and Larry Graham and Stanley Clarke and a very few others, basically defined the sound of bass in the 1970s. He played bass on 4 classic Donald Byrd jazz funk records in the early 70s, and he also guested on a number of Aretha Franklin records, beginning with Young, Gifted, and Black. He also played with Steely Dan, Quincy Jones, Yusuf Lateef, and a whole bunch of those classic CTI releases under Creed Taylor. The second of those bass players is Jerry Jemmett, who played with Aretha. He played on Archie Shepp's Attica Blues. He played in Gil Scott-Heron's The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. And the third is Donald Duck Dunn, who was an absolute pillar for Stax Records in the 1960s, in particular on the records of Booker T and the MGs and Otis Redding. On drums is Bernard Pretty Purdy, who's widely considered to be the most locked-in drummer in terms of session guys anyway, for the whole 1960s and 1970s. The percussionist is Ralph McDonald, who was the go-to guy for CTI Records and its subsidiary Kudu for all those incredible 70s releases by Grover Washington, Ron Carter, Bob James, Hubert Laws, and others. And best of all, on guitar, a little-known guitarist called Duane Allman, who was at the peak of his fame at this point, still doing session work, and who sadly was killed just a couple months after this record comes out in a bike accident. Side 1 starts with Push Push, the title track, which is full-on soul jazz. It's got this excellent 2-chord riff, which is super infectious, and I think largely it was Herbie trying to recapture the magic he had at Memphis Underground, and pretty much succeeding. Musically, the performances are excellent. Not only do you have Duane Allman and Herbie alternating guitar and flute solos all the way through the track, but Chuck Rainey, Pretty Purdy, and Ralph McDonald's the rhythm section are absolutely locked in, and they just make this cut. The next song is an interpretation of Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, which of course had just come out recently. This is a very mellow treatment of that particular song. Obviously, it's an instrumental. This is kind of like, I dig you're concerned about social injustice, baby. Let's talk about it over a Kahlua and milk in my sunken living room, that kind of a feel. And it's kind of a reminder that this album was widely considered at the time as a great record to get high to. Side 1 concludes with a second cover of a contemporary R&B hit, and that's Aretha Franklin's Spirit in the Dark. Her stock and trade was taking sometimes kind of unexceptional or okay versions of original songs and making them into something absolutely spectacular with her own interpretation. It's pretty tough to take an Aretha song and do it better, but if you're going to try, it's probably better to try as an instrumental than to compete on the vocal front. Much like the previous song, this is a more chilled out interpretation. You've got Purdy and McDonald providing the beats. You can't really lose when you've got that underpinning. Halfway through, the intensity starts to mount. You get this great groove that happens under Herbie's solo, and then Duane absolutely lights it up with a great solo, and then you've got Ralph's bongos taking you out. Beautiful, beautiful interpretation of a great song. Side 2 starts with Man's Hope, which is an arrangement by Herbie of all things, the Israeli national anthem, Hatikva, which of course is in turn based on an Italian Renaissance tune, I think from the 16th century. I could be wrong about the timing there. Anyway, I think this is really quite good. The next song is If, which is a cover of a song by the band Bread, written by David Gates. I think it's pretty good, a little formulaic maybe, but really quite lovely. I think, again, sometimes the songs on here can be rescued by the quality of the playing, even when the inspiration in other areas might not be there. Another cover follows, Never Can Say Goodbye. This is quite a mellow treatment of that song. I think really quite gorgeous, actually. And in an eclectic move, the album winds up with a cover of Ray Charles's What I Say. This is a kind of breathless, high-tempo, flute-forward version of this classic. Does it work? It's a little shaky at the beginning, but eventually a real kind of chemistry seems to emerge in the song, and Duane's solos are excellent. Again, you can never really go wrong when you're playing with really good musicians, and the call and answer section of this song between Mann and Allman, which is done vocally by Ray in the song, is really kind of cool. To sum up this album, I think you have to say it's got a really great side 1. Side 2 begins okay, but then the covers, particularly in side 2, are a little bit phoned in. They're rescued, however, by the fact that this is a gathering of brilliant musicians. The songs are pretty much saved by the excellence of the soloists and by the fat, tight rhythm section that's been assembled. As a subgenre, soul jazz wouldn't make it too far into the 1970s. It would eventually get eclipsed by jazz funk, both in terms of popularity and the dance floor and so on. But this is an excellent entry into that catalog. As a record, it's occasionally brilliant, and it never dips below the level of enjoyable. I say light one up, and spin it, and enjoy it, and I give it a 4 out of 5.